Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now today what we're going to tackle is the Soviet naval infantry from the Second World War, which actually fascinated me when I started doing the research on them. The easiest way to think of them, if you've never come across them before, is being very similar to Marines. They are naval infantry, they're part of the Navy itself, and they're trained for things like amphibious operations and landings and such, and I thought it was really interesting. Now, you don't see very many of them on the table, which I'm going to probably repeat a few times because I just found it so interesting doing something new like this. They ended up earning the nickname the Black Death to the Germans because of their rather distinctive black pea coats, which this fella's not wearing, but I am going to make a couple of notes on how you can paint those as we go through this miniature. So as always, all of the paints will be listed in the description below, along with the basing recipe for this fella. Let's get started. So really quick up top, this fella here, he is from the Black Death Kickstarter. He's a 3D printed miniature, and I gotta say I am really keen to see more folks throwing their hat in the ring with historically themed 3D miniatures. There's so many D&D and fantasy figures out there. Seeing somebody tackle these uncommon sort of areas of history is really interesting. So he's from Flank March Miniatures, and they actually scale super well with the Warlord stuff. There is a couple of examples on the Kickstarter page. I'll make sure that everything is linked there. And as well as just the riflemen, there are things like Maxim guns and mortars, so you can actually have an entire army of these guys. Now, there are quite a few scenarios in some of the bolt action books which feature the naval infantry, so it's neat that there is another range out there, something that isn't just metal, and yeah, these are really cool. And on top of that, they are a little bit chunky. Like they are the same height as the Warlord figures, but ever so fractionally chunkier, I would say. So you could scale these down to 1/72 scale if that's something that you like. I don't know if they'd quite make 15mm, but it's interesting. I would give it a shot if that's something that you were interested in. Now, the first thing that I have done is to hit him with a primer spray of grey from Vallejo. Any middling grey is going to work just fine here. If you start from black or white, I would suggest here it's probably going to be a little difficult. There are going to be quite some dark colors on here and as well quite some light ones. So gray is a nice middle ground. So the same as we would with almost any other miniature, we're going to start with his skin. And for this, I'm going to use tanned flesh from the Army Painter. Now I say all the time, there isn't really a correct color to start skin. And bearing in mind the demographic makeup of the Soviet Union, you could start with just about anything you wanted, really have some fun mixing up some of the skin tones in your squads. Now quite commonly I will leave painting rifles until near last, but this time we're going to do it, well, second. I have here orange-brown, and we're going to go over the rifle a couple of times and just go straight over the entire thing. I'm doing this now because in a moment I'm going to use a blackish color, and I can paint in his trousers and his boots and the black bits on his rifle all at the same time. But that's easiest if we paint the wood first. Okay, now for his trousers I'm going to use black grey. This is a really deep dark grey, it's almost black, and it's a nice neutral grey. Now, if he's wearing the pea coat, I would base coat that with the same color. Now, when it comes to dark leather, like black leather, I like to use German grey. Now, this is a very deep, dark, it's a blue-black rather than a neutral grey like black grey is. And I am hoping that you'll see the difference when they're right next to each other like this. If you want a more pronounced difference in color, what you could do here would be to paint in the boots black, but I think this will be just different enough that it will be visible once this is all finished. At the same time, I'm also going to use this as the gunmetal color on the rifle. Now, I can see the difference there in person, but like I said, if you want a slightly better contrast between those two colors, just use a normal straight black for the metal and the boots. I'm now going to paint in some of the white details, and this is a bit of an odd one because normally I would look at painting the coat first, but because he's got this tiny wee bit of his t-shirt showing through, it's going to be easier to just splash in here now, make a mess, and then paint the blue around it. So I'm using here Corax White. Some folks don't have great experiences with it. I've always quite liked it, but it does need an agitator in the container, and you do need to shake the dickens out of it every time you use it. So it's up to you. You can use a straight white here. It won't matter too much. Now, as well as a little thing around his neck, what you can do is get some white on the edge of your brush, and instead of trying to paint a straight line, just wiggle along the edge of his hat to paint in the white cording that's around that. Nice and simple. And now finally we're going to paint in his shirt. Now I'm using here, this is dark Prussian blue, again another Vallejo color. It is very similar to Cantor blue if you want to stick to Citadel paints. Cantor blue is just a tiny bit lighter than this though, I would say. Now take your time as you come up to any areas that you've already painted, and as well try to avoid things like his webbing, his pack and what have you. Since we're going to paint those in quite light colors, it will be easier to do that over the grey that we have primed him in. Now that's going to take a couple of coats, particularly on the sort of upper slopes of his sleeves. You do want to make sure that you've got a nice solid color there. So what I'm going to do next is paint in his pack, and for this I'm using khaki. Any beige-ish sort of equipment color will work here. Khaki's got a nice green, like a very faint green tint to it, which I think works quite well. So khaki and the straps holding it around him. Now this much smaller satchel down at his side here, this one would be a beige sort of color. I'm using Iraqi sand here, and you'll see it covers fairly well, but once this first coat dries, I am definitely going to come back and give it a second. Make sure that you chase the strap around his body with this too. Now this boxy little gizmo on the side here really was a very light grey, so I'm using Administratum grey from Citadel. You could, if you're really careful, you could just leave it the grey primer, but I don't think that's very likely. It's a good idea to give it a coat of something anyway. The parade of colours on this guy feels like it's never ending. What we've got now is flat brown, and I'm going to paint in the leather pouches. Now I'm going to use Retributor armor for his little brass belt buckle here. But again, this is one of those things where it's just brass. Any colour you like will be fine. Now for his hair, I'm going to use German Camo Pale Brown, which, as well as being a mouthful, is a nice pale brown that does cover quite well. If you want to avoid having to paint, bits of hair and what have you, just print the guys that have got the helmets on. On the head of the grenade here, I'm going to use red leather, again another Vallejo colour. Then with a nice small brush and some vermilion, I'm going to paint the red star on the inside of his hat here. Now one last thing I've done is to, with that same brush, just put a little squiggle of Retributor armor across the cap band. I don't know whether or not that's actually going to show up at all when we're finished shading him, but I figured I'd put it down now, just give it a try. What I have here, this is a half and half mix of Army Painter Strong Tone and the Quickshade Mixing Medium. I've really gotten into thinning my shades with whatever medium's available, whether it's Lahmian Medium or the Quickshade Medium. Just tends to make things a little bit smoother. What we're going to do is paint over the entire miniature with this, making sure that it works into any recesses, and any big kludgy pulls of it, move it around while it's still wet. Then once you have covered the entire miniature, leave it somewhere warm to dry for about half an hour. Although, because this can dry a little bit shiny, it can be difficult to tell when it is actually dry. So don't be afraid to leave it for a wee bit longer, just to play it safe. Now once that's dried, you'll have something that looks like this. Now the trouble I tend to find, I really like strong tone, but it does often dry a little bit shiny like this. Now once you've got a bit of practice in, you normally find it's a bit easier to just highlight everything now, and then varnish as a final stage. But what I am going to do to make it a little bit clearer what I'm doing is to nip outside and quickly hit him with a spray of matte varnish now, and then varnish him again later when I'm finished. Now that is going to make things much easier to see. What I'm going to do is take some khaki and I'm going to go back over his pack and his straps just to brighten these up a little bit and leave the shaded stuff in the recesses. I'm going to do this for a couple of colors, so I will call these out quite quickly as I go through them. So first of all, going back over with khaki, and remember you're leaving some of the shaded areas to help define the shape of the miniature here. We'll do the same thing with Iraqi sand. Let's just make sure I haven't got too much on my brush. Now for the little grey duper on the side here, you could do that, but I don't think it's actually going to add very much. I quite like how that looks already. Remember, we're trying to keep things relatively simple here. So I'm going to go back to black grey and go in, do the same thing with his trousers. Just little highlights towards flat areas, which would likely catch the light some. And of course, if he's wearing the pea coat, do that to that as well. Now that does not show up on camera at all. It's pretty subtle in reality too. If you do want a slightly more pronounced look, just mix in a tiny wee touch of a lighter grey. Now we are going to change things up when it comes to his shirt, and instead of highlighting this with the dark Prussian blue we used, I'm now going to use Prussian blue. And rather than going over quite so much of it, I'm going to just try and catch near to the edges of creases and folds in his uniform. Now this will look quite pronounced going on, but it will soften and chill out a bit as it dries. But I actually quite like a slightly over-the-top, thicker finish on miniatures like this. Really it's a matter of taste and style, but me, I've got so much taste and style, I think I can do it how I like. Now just a tiny bit of red leather right at the corners of these pouches. Something that you don't have to highlight if you don't really fancy though. Now at last we're going to tackle the square cloth around his neck. Now what I'm going to use, this is Hoeth blue, but Teclis blue or any medium and fairly rich blue is going to work quite well for this. Now in reality, this is a blue cloth with normally 2 or 3 thin white lines around the edges. But painting that is going to be, at this scale, I'd say unnecessary. So what I'm going to do is quite carefully just try and paint so there's one line just off center. Now this is going to be way easier without the camera in the way, unfortunately. But if I'm slow and careful, I'm going to paint that edge, leave a gap, and then paint some blue again. Then if I make a mess, I can come back and tidy up with some white. Now that did not go quite as planned. That thin white line didn't really pan out as I'd hoped. Now one of the other ways I've seen people paint this is to leave a thick white line just on the edge of the cloth, and in hindsight that would probably have been much easier. What I am going to do now, I'm committed. I've got some matte white from the army painter, and I'm going to paint that line to brighten it up with some fresh white and tidy as I go. There we go, that's better. Now tidied up, that looks much more interesting. It's a little bit more fussy than I might have liked, but the end result, that's not too bad. Maybe I'll think about how I'll do that next time. What I have now is Cadian flesh tone, and we're going to paint in his face and his hands. Now, same as usual, we're going to cover over most of his skin with this, and leave just our shaded tanned flesh in the recesses. One of the things I really like about these particular faces is that they are loaded with character, so they're actually pretty easy to paint. What I'm going to do now is just a little bit of Kislev flesh, and this time, rather than concentrating on most of his face and leaving just the shading behind, we're going to use this to basically bulk out a little of his expression. So his cheekbones, his brow, his chin are all going to be fine candidates for this. You don't have to do very much, just little short lines, and that'll be plenty. Then what we'll do is dab in the backs of his knuckles, just to add a little bit of volume to his hands as well. Now, the last thing I'm going to do on his face today is actually to answer a question that comes up fairly regularly on Twitter when people ask, "Oh, how do you do the stubble?" And I'm sorry I gave you all a very silly voice when you're asking perfectly reasonable questions. All you need is a little bit of apothecary white, not very much, and just paint it over his cheeks towards the bottom of his jaw. Don't forget his chin, just try not to paint his bottom lip. And yeah, it is as easy as this. Watch this once this dries. Easy as that. Just enough to give a little bit of a ghostly appearance around the sides of his face. Job's a good one. What I am going to do now is varnish him again. Obviously, like I said, you can just do this once, but I am going to do it twice because it's going to make quite a difference to the highlights that I've added. You see, now what did I tell you? What a difference a good varnish makes. Now the last thing that I'm going to do is actually to buff the metalwork on the rifle here with a pencil. This is a B, although you can use a 2B, so your choices are 2B or not 2B. And just a little bit of pencil at the edge of the metalwork, and there you go. Job's a good one. It's important to do this after the varnish because that will give you a nice, especially a matte varnish, will have a slightly rough finish to it that'll help catch the graphite from this. So once I'm finished fooling around with this now, what I'm going to do is pop a base on him. Let's get a look at what he looks like when he's all finished. And there at last, our Soviet Naval Infantryman is complete. And he was actually really interesting to do. The research on this guy was a lot of fun, and I think that it doesn't take very much to get quite a nice result for the tabletop. Now this fella in particular, you'll notice there weren't a lot of additional colors, there wasn't any complex mixing. The Prussian blues from Vallejo do a lot of the heavy lifting, and I quite like that result. So as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue. And today, hopefully, you should see pop up on screen here, ooh, high tech these days, my wonderful producers. So if you've got any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.